Hi guys, it's Olivia here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and today I'm here to give you my September wrap-up. In the month of September I read 14 books, so let's get right down to what I read. The first book that I read in the month of September was The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and this one was an interesting read. So we follow this main character and she decides that she is going to become a vegetarian. But to be honest, why is it called The Vegetarian? Because she actually goes vegan. However, her husband isn't too happy with that and her mental illness just goes on a downward spiral as she fights against her family to be allowed to be vegan. And yeah, a lot of stuff happens in this book, and by the way, I'm going to be leaving trigger warnings for all of these books in the comment section in my description box down below. But I really struggled with The Vegetarian because I did not enjoy reading it. I just found it too disgusting. Like, the first two perspectives that you get in this book are male perspectives, and the way that they view this woman and the way they look at her body and the way that they treat her is just absolutely disgusting, and it was making my skin crawl being in their perspective. And then we got a female perspective, which I liked more, and it was almost like a refreshing breath of fresh air to finally get to her perspective. But at the same time, just the things that were happening were just disturbing, and I feel like for the beginning of the book to the middle I was so confused. Like, I didn't understand the point of the book, like what was I getting out of reading this content. But then by the end of it I feel like I understood a little bit what they were getting at, kind of, maybe. And it just, I don't know, this whole book was very, very disturbing for me. It was a very interesting experience, but it's not one that I ever want to have again. Someone replied to my Insta story and she said that what she got from this book was that she would never treat anybody this way because of how it made her feel when she read the text, and I feel like that's a very good thing to get out of the book. However, when I finished the book, that wasn't what I got out of it. So yeah, moving on. Then I'm going to talk about the children's literature that I read for my children's literature class. And that was a reread for me, and that was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, and I actually really enjoyed rereading this one. So this one follows this gang of boys and all of the trouble that they kind of get into in their neighborhood, pretty much that, and it's a very coming of age story. It's a classic and one of the first, well, not one of the first, but one of the very well-known beginner young adult books. I didn't expect the writing to be as young as it was. It felt a little bit juvenile at times, but I'm going to put that to the fact that S.E. Hinton was quite young when she wrote this herself. But once you get past the writing style, you just fall in love with these grey area characters, these gang of boys who aren't exactly good, but they aren't exactly bad either. Really like Ponyboy. I really like the family kind of dynamic, the found family aspect of the book. And I didn't really remember what happened. It also features one of my favourite poems by Robert Frost, like not my favourite poem, but my favourite Robert Frost poem. And you know, it was just so nice to go back down this road and enjoy this book once again. Then I had to read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl, and this was quite a shocking reread for me because I remember that when I was young I absolutely loved this book. It was amazing to me. I loved the movie, but rereading this with an adult lens and studying it just kind of destroyed the story for me. I didn't hate it, but it's problematic. So one of the things that, let me tell you what it's about Charlie. He's this young boy and Willy Wonka has this huge chocolate factory that's very famous, but nobody ever goes in and nobody ever comes out. Charlie puts in this ad where 5 golden tickets get given to children if they find it in a chocolate bar, and those kids get to go to the chocolate factory and experience all the behind the scenes. When I read this book, I was still in awe of the fact that Roald Dahl has such a creative mind. Like, the things and inventions that he comes up with are so unique and so creative. Who thinks like that? Who thinks of those? It's absolutely amazing. It's written in such an easy to read way. It is middle grade, so just be aware of that, but it's just so easy to read and I literally flew through it in a single day. However, it is incredibly racist. Because if you think about it, the Oompa Loompas are natives basically who are taken from their home. When they live in their home, they are kind of savage. They can't even fend for themselves. They're starving, they're poor. But at the mention of getting paid in cocoa beans and not even in money, they leap for the chance to work for Willy Wonka forever and ever. They don't need payment. They're happy to be paid in food, and they wear like tribal clothes, but now they speak English, and they're always happy working for Willy Wonka and never leaving the factory and always being trapped in there. As well as that, when Willy Wonka tests out his products, they all get experimented on the Oompa Loompas. That seems really problematic if you think about it. It was very fatphobic. The way that Augustus Gloop is described is kind of disgusting to me, because they just make so much fun of the fact that he is overweight. And then secondly, there are some ableist moments. The fact that one of the grandpas cannot move and cannot get out of bed, but at the sign of a good thing that could happen, he kind of hops out of bed and he's suddenly well and able-bodied. And then also at the end, there's this moment where there are people who are in a bed who say that they don't want to go anywhere. They're basically trapped in this bed and they can't move for themselves. So they say they don't want to do something, yet they pick up the bed and make these characters do it anyway, which is just ableist to move someone by force if they explicitly stated that they don't want to do that. So be aware that that's in the book, and those things kind of brought it down for me in terms of enjoyment. But if we're just going to ignore all of that, it's entertaining and it's funny and it's also nostalgic, but it's also problematic. So I'll just leave you with that. Then I read Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, and it was all right. I read this in a single day as well. It's about this pig called Wilbur, and he grows up on this farm, and Charlotte is this girl who can understand what the animals say, but Wilbur is being fattened up for Christmas, so the animals in the farm all decide to think of ways to save him. It's a like pro-vegetarianism kind of book, but it's also told through a child's lens. I think it just had no effect on me. I'm not someone who really feels a lot of empathy towards animals in books when I read about animals. Like, I don't really care. So this book is just not for me, but it might be for you. I have nothing more to say. I just read this one and I was like, moving on. So also last month I went on a huge poetry bender and decided that I needed to read all of the poetry. So let's talk about the poetry that I read. So the first one I read is Four Colored Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough and Spell 7 by Entezaki Shunga. And this poetry collection got 5 stars for me, but this poetry collection only includes 2 poems. So Entezaki Shunga writes this kind of poetry which is a choreo poem, which is a poem that includes stage directions, so it's almost like a mashup of a play and a poem, and dance and music is involved. It's so unique. I have never read poetry like that, and I found it so amazing and so impactful and powerful. In her poem For Colored Girls Who is considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, it follows these different black women who are talking about their struggles of being a black woman. The writing was just amazing. The stories were heartbreaking and difficult to read, and the way the poetry was worded just struck something deep within me. It moved me so much. And Spell 7 was similar. It focused a bit more on trying to work and get a job as a black person in America at the time, but these poems were just amazing, and if you want to read some classic black poetry, I definitely recommend trying Entezaki Shunga. I continued on with her poetry by reading a poetry collection called Daughter Dorothy by Entezaki Shunga, and this one was just normal poetry. I did like it. I do think that some of the poems went a bit over my head because there were references to Latinx countries that I just don't know about, and I just didn't know the meaning of those things. So the fact that they went over my head is not a reflection on her poetry at all. It's a reflection on the fact that I just didn't know enough while reading those poems, and I didn't stop to look things up, which is something I should have done. But her poetry was still really good, and I very much enjoyed that poetry collection. The next one that I read was Insomnia by John Kinsella, and this was also fantastic. I just didn't expect it to hit me as much as it did. So it's an environmentally friendly charged poetry collection, so you've got a lot of nature imagery, and he's also an Australian author, so it's very focused on places in Australia and things in Australia, so you get a lot of those references in his poems, and it just struck me so much about how humans and nature are one. Like, in our minds we try to separate ourselves from nature and make it seem like nature is not what we belong in or what we live in or what we're part of, but this poetry collection really fuses them both together, and I feel like that's such an important reminder for the way that we treat the world today. And the poems and the way they were worded were pretty fantastic. I wouldn't recommend this to poetry beginners because it does take a bit of analysing and a bit of deep diving, but other than that, fantastic. Then I read Biochemistry by Tricia Dearborn. She's an Australian poet, and this poetry collection just was really random. I can't really tell you what it's all about because she has some that have to do with science, some that are a response to Virginia Woolf's writing, some that are just about romance, and it was just like a whole bunch of random poems pulled into one poetry collection. I didn't really like it, if you could tell. I felt like the poetry was a bit oversimplified and it didn't feel like a unanimous piece of art, which is something that I quite like to have in poetry collections, and I think they should be. So then after that I read Rainforest by Aline Chong. She is an Asian Australian poet. I believe, I can't tell you for sure, but I believe she's either from Hong Kong and Singapore, or like born in Singapore, studied in Hong Kong, and then came to Sydney where she lives now. So her poems were very much about being of 3 different cultures and 3 different worlds, and that is something I could very much relate to. And her poems are very structured, very precise, structured, very precise words. There's no words in her poems that she doesn't need. I felt like it didn't quite vibe with me, but that was not because her poems were bad. It was just personal preference with the way that she writes, but it was still a decent read. And then last but not least, for poetry, I got my other 5-star read of this month, and that was These Wild Houses by Omar Sakar. So this was his debut poetry collection. I believe he has another one, which I shall be reading. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, just because his poems are very much about that. So Omar Sakar is a bisexual Muslim Arab Australian poet, and those are his identities that he has on his poetry collection. I'm not assuming. I know, guys, I did my research. And he also came from a background which was a little bit of a dysfunctional family. He also kind of lived in, not quite had his own house. He was just squatting in some cases and just kind of flickering between different homes, making ends meet. So these poems kind of reflect all of that, and you would think that his poetry would be raw and angry and dark and upsetting because of these themes about like homophobia, acceptance, finding your own home, living in a dysfunctional family, but it's not. All of this anger and maybe frustration that he feels about his past is channeled into carefully crafted, amazingly well written poetry, and it hits you deep. There's some anger in it, there's some frustration, but there's sadness, there's beauty, there's happiness, and all of these emotions are just brimming in his words. He uses images and metaphors that I just wouldn't think of myself, and I just found it so creative and amazing. I was blown away that this was his debut collection, and I cannot wait to see what he's written next. Then after that, I've got my only physical book to show you, and that is That Asian Kid by Savita Kalan. I think I unboxed this in a vlog, and I'll try to find the right vlog and link it up there. But this one follows Jivan, who is doing his GCSEs and his exams, and he's trying to just pass as best as he can. He's very smart, but he has this one particular teacher who always grades him lower, and he starts to suspect that she's a bit racist towards the coloured kids in her classes. When he goes on a walk in the forest, he comes across this teacher doing something unsavory with another teacher, and he films it on his phone. So here's this video that he could use to take down this teacher who he thinks is unfair to students in her classes, him as well, and he's kind of debating whether he should use this footage or not. So I've got my full review on my blog, and I'll leave a link to that down below. I did enjoy this one. It was very interesting. I felt a bit morally mixed because I couldn't like Jivan for the fact that he was even considering using this footage and not tackling it in other ways. I can understand why he felt like his back was up in a corner, though. From the way that this book goes about things, you get to see why he really struggles to be accepted and have his views heard. So it was a very interesting way of talking about how racism can manifest in modern day, and especially with the power dynamic between the student and the teacher and whose side people tend to be on. So very interesting book, very thought-provoking. It wasn't the most exciting because it's all set in a school and he's a student just going about his school life, but it was still very interesting to read. And then the last 3 novels that I read were new adult romances. So the first one we've got is Love Story by Adriana Herrera. Again, I have a review for this on my blog, so I was also sent that one for review. And in this one, we follow these 2 characters, Patrice and Easton. So this book was really interesting, guys. I'm excited to tell you about it. So Patrice is this black man who is very politically active, and he's an activist, especially for the rights of black people who just want to live their life in America. And then we've got Easton, who works for the law and he works on SVU cases. He's actually a trust fund baby, but he doesn't want to just live with his money and that's it. He wants to give back to the community, and that's why he's decided to be a lawyer. And they start to have a little bit of a romance, but the thing is that in Easton's county, black people and people of colour are being pulled over on the road for no reason, and that's basically just what's happening in America with police stops and police brutality and things like that. So that becomes very complicated in their romance because Patrice thinks that Easton's law firm is not doing enough to handle the police who are stopping people unfairly, and he's an activist, and Easton is from the SVU unit, so it's not even from, you know, the main head of things or the right side of the law firm, and he feels like he can't really do much. So they're having this big political clash in their romantic relationship, and I feel like even though it's a new adult romance and there are some explicit scenes, it very much largely focuses on this, and I appreciated that because the explicit scenes weren't really cutting it for me in this one, but I was very interested in this political debate and whether the characters were on the right or wrong or doing the right or wrong things, because don't think it's all going to be on Easton, who is the white character. They both made a lot of mistakes, and I feel like this book delved into that topic deeply and so well. Check out my review for more on that. And last but not least, I reread How to Bang a Billionaire and How to Blow It with a Billionaire by Alexis Hall. I remembered most of the events from the first one and basically remembered nothing from the second one. So in the first one, we follow Arden. He is this university student and he's just about to graduate, go through his exams, when he starts to have a relationship with a billionaire. However, this billionaire has a lot of hang-ups basically that they have to work through, and they both have to learn what it means to be in a relationship. Arden especially needs to grow some self-confidence, so they're just figuring out their relationship together, and both of them have a little bit of a kinky side when it comes to their sex life, so that's also explored. I really like the first one. The writing style is just superb. You know I love Alexis Hall writing style, and it was just fantastic. And then we get to the second one where it gets a lot more about explicit scenes, about consensual sex and what that means, limits, setting boundaries, and I found it all very, very healthy, and I was just loving it. And then the ending happened, and I don't know how I survived 1.5 years with that cliffhanger and not having the last book. Not sure how I did it, amazed, but now reading the third book and I'm very much excited to get to it. So there you have it. Those are the 14 books that I read in the month of September. Please let me know in the comment section down below what was your favourite read in the month of September, and have you read any of the books that I talked about. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more, and don't forget to hit that notification bell every time to be updated every time I have a new video, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.